Very good afternoon, distinguished guest speakers and ladies and gentlemen. I'm Kanika Kaur, a research analyst at the Institute of South Asian Studies, and I have the pleasure of being your MC today. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies, as well as ISAS-ISEAS Institute, I welcome you to today's joint panel titled From Dialogue to Action, Deepening India-ASEAN Engagement. I would like to introduce the following distinguished panelists who are currently on stage with us. Firstly, we have Ambassador Gurjeet Singh, who is the former ambassador of India. We also have with us Ms. Joanne Lin, who is the Senior Fellow and Coordinator at the ASEAN Studies Center at the ISAS-ISEAS Institute. We also, lastly, but not the least, we have Mr. Ravi Vellore, who's the Associate Editor and Senior Columnist at the Straits Times Singapore. And chairing this session will be Associate Professor Dr. Iqbal Singh Sevia, who's the Director of our institute. Dr. Sevia.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for this very interesting and very timely event entitled India and ASEAN, Building Partnerships for the Future. On the behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, I'm particularly delighted that this event is co-hosted with our constant collaborators, I should say, the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, Yusof Ishak Institute. Now, as I mentioned, this event is timely and important. Timely, if for no other reason, the very fact that Singapore's Prime Minister is on a visit to India to mark the 60th celebration of bilateral relations between the two sides. And Singapore has played an important role in fostering better relations, closer ties between India and ASEAN. And I'm sure we'll be hearing more of that. Now, if we look in the long period of history, we find that there are very strong links between the two regions, between India and Southeast Asia, be they the flow of ideas, trade, people, religious traditions, etc. But today we'll be focusing particularly on what happened in the post-Cold War era till today. Now, if we look at the post-Cold War era, the sort of and I won't go into, I'm a historian, so I'm going to resist my tendency to contextualize and historicize everything, but just jump to the Cold War, post-Cold War period and say that, there were new dimensions, new geopolitical calculations that arose with the end of the Cold War. And what you found was India launched its Look East policy, which subsequently metamorphosized into its Act East policy. And we can see that broadening relationship with ASEAN, if we just map the sort of relations that the two have had diplomatically. In 1992, India became a sectoral dialogue partner to ASEAN. And in 2022, marking 30 years of that relationship, the relationship was elevated to a comprehensive strategic partnership. Now, this relationship has held firm. There have been some questions about which way it should go, etc. Those are the hard things that I leave to the speakers to talk about, except to point out that there are certain questions, concerns, and ambitions and hopes today as well, as the world is going through what we should maybe best describe as a period of geopolitical flux in the world. As we are grappling what the new world order will be, what sort of alignments the world would face, India, on its part, has reasserted the centrality of ASEAN. ASEAN countries are looking forward to seeing how this relationship will develop. But there have also been some questions about how these two are going to develop their economic relations. One factor, and I think many of us are familiar with the recent comments by India's Commerce Minister, Piyush Goyal, have given rise to perhaps some consternations in Southeast Asia about not only the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, but how India sees ASEAN. But again, India has reasserted the importance of this relationship. Bilateral relations will continue to grow with countries, but also bilateral relations between India and ASEAN. And the question we have for our panelists today is how do they see this going forward? And we are delighted to have an outstanding panel with us today. Of course, I'll stick to the batting order on our program. If for no other reason, the fact that Ambassador Gurjeet Singh is one of the most distinguished diplomats of India. He has been ambassador to Germany, Indonesia, Ethiopia, ASEAN, and to the African Union as well. And as it happens to be, we are delighted that we are actually launching his latest book, The Mango Flavor, India and ASEAN After a Decade of the Act East Policy. So his visit here and the publication of the book provides a good opportunity for us to reflect on this relationship. Following him, we will move to Ms. Joanne Lim, who is, of course, our collaborator from ISIS, Yusof Ishak Institute. Joanne has spent years in the ASEAN Secretariat and is now at ISIS, Yusof Ishak Institute, and she'll offer a perhaps what I could describe as an insider's perspective to how ASEAN sees India, and you'll be talking about the survey as well. And then we'll move to Mr. Ravi Velu, who's associated with ISAS, I must also add as well. Ravi has covered India and ASEAN for decades now, and I think I'll ask him to speak from some of his personal reflections on how he's seen this relationship evolve. Of course, most of you are familiar with Ravi, but I'll still point out that he has had 4 decades in journalism, including 2 stints in South Asia and Asia Week and the Straits Times, which enrich our conversation with his deep knowledge of ASEAN and India. So with that, I don't want to hold you back from the people you are actually here to listen to. And I'm looking forward to learning more from this discussion as well. So Ambassador Gurjit Singh, could I invite you to share your thoughts and maybe speak a bit about the book and looking ahead?
Thank you, Iqbalji. I would particularly like to recognize my brother. Family at a time when your book is released is very important to support you. And I'm very happy that my school cohort who lives in Singapore is all here. Thank you for your support too. Iqbalji, you have always been very supportive. I think in the last 3 books that I have written, they've always been discussed at ISAS. So thank you. And this time also, when I had constraint of time, he stepped forward very quickly and said, no, we'll do it. And thank you all for being here at short notice for this discussion. If every ASEAN member state was like Singapore, the nature of this book would have been different. But it is because ASEAN member states are diverse that this book is important, because it judges how India moves with ASEAN at varied speeds. I was in Japan in 1992 when the Look East policy was launched. And I was an ambassador to ASEAN when the Act East policy was launched. So one of the most significant features of that is that the Act East policy has ASEAN as its focus and covers all 3 communities rather than only the economic community. So I think that is the biggest achievement of the Act East policy. Now, when we look at the Act East policy and we look ahead into see, I think the question which arises today is that in 2025, we are all engrossed in a diplomatic churn in the world, which was totally unexpected in January 2025. It happened suddenly. So diplomats are very uncomfortable with uncertainty. And this is the period of maximum discomfort for ex-diplomats and current diplomats, because you don't know what tomorrow brings. In this, I believe ASEAN is a source of stability and confidence for India. The question I ask in my book, is it true for ASEAN with India? That question is answered in the book. We have the Act East policy and we have about 40 arrangements between India and ASEAN. But the question which remains hanging is our engagement enough in the 21st century? We keep changing the title, sectoral, dialogue, summit, comprehensive. At the end of it, what? Are we still there? Are we ahead? So this is a time when I think we need to look more at each other directly without looking over our shoulders. I don't think India expects ASEAN to be in total coherence with us on, let us say, China policy. I think on Indo-Pacific, we have now come to an agreement, and we actually have an AOIP, IPOI coordination mechanism. Not satisfactory to India, I must say, but good to start with, need to do more. And finally, on trade. So I'm going to just cover these to make the few remarks. I think our level of engagement is inadequate if 2 entities like ASEAN and India are to take this world towards stability. I know Singapore is talking to small countries to set up a WTO plus mechanism to stabilize trade. But I wish India and ASEAN would do more together to stabilize the world. I think that conversation is inadequate. We don't speak enough about Ukraine to each other. We don't speak enough about Gaza to each other. We did speak about COVID to each other. But I think we tend to overlook that we have a common view of the world as global South partners. But that issue doesn't seem to come out when we have India-ASEAN conversations. So that is one. Level of engagement must go up. Second, ASEAN believes that all its dialogue partners must act the same way. But we are the only dialogue partner who's a developing country. So we should be seen through a global South perspective and not as a North-South perspective. And that aspect my book brings out, how India is expected to do everything for ASEAN in terms of development partnership rather than be seen as a partner. Partner means that you pay some, I pay some, not I pay all. So that is not, and when I interviewed people, they said, well, all other DPs pay. So if we make an exception for India, others may start asking us to pay. But that doesn't help the India-ASEAN partnership. So the global South perspective, I believe, must come into play between India and ASEAN, and that will not only benefit us, it will benefit the global South. Some years ago, ASEAN countries were disinterested in BRICS. Now 4 are there. So it is all in 2025, no? So it is all changed. But did they discuss with India that let's get into BRICS? So it was not an India-ASEAN decision to get into BRICS. Or now that some of them are observers in SCO. So these conversations are not happening. They are India-ASEAN conversations, not India-ASEAN regional, not India-ASEAN global conversations. These, I think, need to increase. I'm not apportioning blame. I'm just saying this is what is, and both sides need to look into this. Now comes trade. Iqbalji mentioned the statement by our Commerce Minister. So there is an immense amount of frustration in India with ASEAN on trade. So I have written recently something which will come out soon, saying we cannot ignore that in whatever way ITGA functions, ITGA, ASEAN-India Trade in Goods Agreement, we still have $100 billion plus trade with ASEAN and FDI with ASEAN. And there are only 5 entities with whom we have this: the United States, China, UAE, EU, and ASEAN. So if ASEAN is already there at that level, why are we tinkering with the process? We should improve the process. In India, the feeling is that ASEAN is not responsive and it takes too long to get things done. It takes too long because there are 10 different opinions. There's no single opinion on trade in ASEAN. ASEAN feels that India did not fulfill its own commitments, and the ASEAN-India Business Council keeps complaining about this in every report they write. But this is the problem. They keep writing reports. Who reads them on either side? Who acts on them? Unclear. So I think we need to look at trade in the modern context, that if India and ASEAN work together, we could again bring what I said, stability and confidence to things. ASEAN often talks about trust, and I think your survey often has this trust factor. I don't know why ASEAN people trust or don't trust India. Sometimes I feel they distrust somebody else in a particular year, so the trust for India relatively goes up, but I'm not sure. In India, the trust is measured on one factor. How do you deal with trade? Is it fair? Is it justified? And is it correct? And if they feel that it is not, unfortunately, the engagement on other pillars is not so strong that it can overcome the lack of trust. I don't call it distrust, lack of trust on trade. So one way of overcoming that, raise the political security collaboration, raise the socio-cultural collaboration. Singapore has very good ideas on the socio-cultural side. And these are not Ramayana and Mahabharata. These are digital, dealing with DIFA, dealing with things like post-pandemic recovery. One of the things that I like to promote, and in the book I've written a fair amount about it, is impact investing. On SDGs, we are lagging behind India and ASEAN. How can we do this better? In India, we are experimented successfully with impact investing. So impact investing in ASEAN is also popular, but not ASEAN-wide. Indonesia is the darling of private impact investing funds. Vietnam is the darling of DFIs. It's all in my book based on surveys. How do we bring it together? In fact, I'm going to Jakarta now trying to talk about this to the ASEAN Secretariat, to Indonesia, and we want to have an India-ASEAN collaboration on impact investing to achieve the SDGs through private investment and not leave it to governments. So one of the hypothesis in my book is that India and ASEAN can do much together outside governments by engaging the private sector, engaging CSOs, engaging public. I don't know how many of you know there was an India-ASEAN youth camp in Goa last week, but it's not widely publicized. It's only known in ASEAN circles. It's not a common thing to know. So one of the things that I discuss in my book is, and this is based on a survey, that what are the cultural icons which India and ASEAN should pursue beyond the Ramayana and Mahabharata. So there were two important ones which came out. One is Bollywood, and the other one is literature. Why does India and ASEAN not do more together on literature? Why are there such few ASEAN? Now, again, when I say ASEAN, leave Singapore out of this. Singapore is a different kettle of fish. Other than Singapore, there are no ASEAN writers coming to India. And there are no Indian writers going to ASEAN except a bit to Ubud. So this is something which needs to do more. The India-ASEAN network of think tanks could do with a total revamp and work on project base rather than ad hoc discussions every year. The Delhi dialogue should not be allowed to die. These are all initiatives which happened when I was ambassador. So I feel sad today when they are withering away. But recently, when the Indonesian president was in India, his ministers got together at Rashtrapati Bhavan during the banquet and sang a song, Kuch Kuch Hota Hai. The video went viral. But my comment on this is, Kuch Kuch Hota is 1998. In 2025, India and ASEAN need to find new songs to sing together, and that will take us ahead. Thank you.
Thank you for ending on a very musical note as well.
I heard this song before.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I'll have some questions later, which I'll open up. But I'd like now to invite Ms. Joanne Lin. And Joanne is certainly very well placed to share perspectives from the ASEAN point of view. And particularly so because he's a senior fellow and a coordinator of the ASEAN Studies Center in ISAS. So Joanne, over to you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Iqbal, and very good afternoon, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just going to begin by congratulating you, Ambassador Gurjit Singh, on the launch of your book, The Mango Flavor. And I think I read about 3/4 of that book, and I believe it's a really popular book in India and Southeast Asia. But of course, you know, it actually requires a lot of cultivation to bring out the sweetness of the fruit. It's a very, very apt metaphor, you know, for ASEAN-India relations, because we can see that it's very rich in promises, right? And it's also very deep-rooted. You talk about the culture. And it requires, of course, a lot of patience, a lot of consistency, and very careful nurturing. So this is something that we actually have to keep in mind. And I can also resonate a lot with you because I was also in Jakarta for over 6 years. But of course, I left in 2015, and that I started in 2015, and that was the year you left being an ambassador there. And of course, I can see a lot of connections between the culture and the historical linkages between India and Southeast Asia. And in fact, I think the Bollywood star Shah Rukh Khan, when he visited Jakarta, oh man, it was phenomenon. So when you talk about that song, yes, I can understand as well. But it's not just about like Indonesia, but there's also a lot of Indo-China countries, right? Which I believe you mentioned in your book. That's Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, and diaspora, Singapore and Malaysia. And that's where you can see how deep-rooted, that sort of civilization links remains until today. So in my short presentation around like maximum 15 minutes, I'm just going to talk about ASEAN-India relations through the lens of perceptions. And that's where, I'm actually going through. You might have seen this survey before, many of you here. I'm just going to go through some of these perceptions about India. And then after that, I'm going to talk about the strategic convergence where ASEAN and India actually align. And that's where I'm going to spend a part of it talking about the global south, because you mentioned, oh, we've never talked about it. So now I'm going to talk about it. And then, end up with economic relations that, of course, Dr. Iqbal has also talked about, and of course, some challenges and where we can actually do more together. So let me just go straight into this survey. And this survey is actually a flagship survey of my institute. Now, actually in the 7th edition, I'm sure you have been following clearly. It started in 2019 to actually gauge the views and perceptions of Southeast Asians opinion makers. So I would say this is an elite survey to find out their views on regional geopolitical developments, major power influence and rivalry. So in this year's survey, we actually had 9. I hope you can actually see this. It's a little bit small. But we had 9 questions about India. And I just want to be clear that India actually doesn't stand out as the most influential actor in our region. I think we have to be very honest about it. It still lags behind countries like the US, China, or even Japan in terms of visibility. But I think what is very striking here is how India has actually improved its rating across multiple categories. So I'm just going to just show you some examples. So this is the economic influence that you see here. I'm not sure if it's very small, but I think you can see it's actually quite small. But what I want to point out is that this year, India's rank has actually gone up from the 9th place to the 8th place, and it increased from 0.6 to 1.9%. And that even surpassed countries like Australia, South Korea, and even the UK, which is actually quite a shift within a year. And the story is also very similar, for the political and strategic influence, because last year India was ranked last. But then this year it has risen 6th place from 0.6 to, from 0.4 to 2.3%. So, that is actually ahead of countries like Australia and UK. So while India really is not a strategic heavyweight in Southeast Asia, I would say that the upward trajectory shows that the region increasingly notice India's strategic presence. And I think that's very important. And the improvement actually also extends to how Asia sees India's role in the global order. So the survey shows actually a stronger recognition of India as a leader in championing free trade. And India has actually moved up from the last spot last year. It has moved up 2 ranks, or it actually moves up to the 6th place this year, as you can see under 2025. And similarly, when we asked about the upholding a rules-based order and international law, you can actually see that India has moved up 2 ranks in this category. So that's good between this year and last year and this year. So this is a very, very interesting question where we ask about the strategic relevance of ASEAN's dialogue partner. So India also rose quite significantly this year from the 9th place last year to actually 6th place this year. And it's actually ahead of many middle powers, including South Korea, UK, Russia, Canada, and New Zealand. And some of these, as you know, are long-standing dialogue partners of ASEAN. Even some like Australia has already celebrated 50th anniversary. And now I want to look at really the in ASEAN's hedging behavior, which is how the region manages the uncertainties of US-China rivalry. So here, you mentioned in your book as well. So here, India is actually the third choice, and more respondents this year is they are choosing India as a strategic partner to hedge against major power rivalry compared to last year. And that actually suggests a gradual but steady recognition of India's role as a balancing force. So in your book, you mentioned that India's strategic autonomy has really been a key factor as the region, doesn't want to take sides. And then now I'm going to look at the final question, which you have mentioned, and that's really the perception of trust. Here, just look at the blue, the blue box. The trust in India has grown, and a larger share of respondents now believe that India will actually do the right thing to contribute to peace, security, prosperity, and governance. However, at the same time, I would say that distrust or a little lack of trust remains slightly higher overall. And for those who distrust India, they often cite the perception that India lacks either the capacity or political will to play a global leadership role, or that it's too inward looking. Such as preoccupied with the domestic and South Asian issues. But those who trust India highlights that it's seen as a responsible stakeholder, one that respects and champions international law. So here again, we actually see a more balanced and nuanced picture compared to previous years. But also what I would like to show is the soft power, aspect. I mean, just to be objective here, we want to cover all grounds. But of course, India does a little bit less well in this aspect because it's actually rated last as a destination for either working, living, or even as a favorite holiday destination. But, as I mentioned before, there must be some ways to strengthen these strong civilization ties, right? As well as people-to-people linkages. And you did mention Bollywood, and I'm a great fan of Bollywood. And in fact, Bollywood movies are so long, right? You don't get 1.5. It's like 3-4 hours, and I can spend the entire Saturday, being on it. And my husband was saying, why is it like this? You're there the whole, afternoon. I said, oh, because that's an Indian movie. Yeah, and that's Bollywood. But yes, I can really appreciate that. But of course, there are also a lot of factors in, this sort of soft power influence. And this is just my personal experience, telling me that there are things like, visa applications. It's just Singapore we have visa free, right, to many countries. I don't have visa free to India. And the last time that I went there, I had to fill out like 10 pages, maybe 15 pages, I'm not sure.
To fill up the
form. And I had to talk about my mother, father, brother, sister, what they do, their occupation, age, and everything. And I'm like, oh man, how many persons I have to call up, just to fill this up. So I believe that there might be sort of some kind of bottleneck, and if you have some influence, I think we can talk about it, because I think visa-free entry will definitely boost things like that. So now I just want to go in and talk about the improvement in perceptions. I think all of us will be. This is an analysis to the stats. So why have the perceptions actually improved apart from the soft power? So I think there are several factors at play. First is India has stepped up its diplomatic engagement in Southeast Asia in recent years, including with smaller countries like Brunei, Singapore, and Laos, which Prime Minister Modi actually visited last year, and including his participation in the ASEAN-India Summit, the East Asia Summit in Vientiane, and of course now Singapore Prime Minister is in India, as Prof. Iqbal has said. So these are actually the countries, if you look down at the country level, that rank India slightly higher in the survey. And it's important that actually India is paying attention not only to the bigger players. It's easy to look at the bigger players, but we want to look at the region as a whole as well. And second, I think it's because of India's strategic positioning as well. So we talk about autonomy, but now I also want to talk about multi-alignment, because you know that you are in most of the different forums, from BRICS to SCO to Quad as well. So, you know, at the time when the region is caught between an increasingly sharp US-China rivalry, I feel that India is viewed as a partner that really offers another option, is strong enough to matter, but not exactly, you know, overwhelming or coercive. So that makes India a good hedging partner. And at the same time, I think India has also positioned itself as a leading voice of the Global South. So that's where I come in on your Global South, because India has convened the Voice of the Global South Summit in 2023, and it's really seen as a champion of development, of climate justice, and equitable growth during its G20 presidency in 2023. And I thought that was actually pretty impressive. So this role actually resonates, you know, with many in ASEAN. You know, countries like Malaysia and Indonesia has been talking a lot about it. They see themselves as part of the Global South and value India's effort to really amplify their concerns on the world stage. And then the third is India has actually made efforts to align with ASEAN's own priorities. Prof. Iqbal mentioned about ASEAN centrality and the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative being aligned with the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, and, you know, focusing a lot on functional cooperation rather than, you know, just talking about securitization. And finally, I just share a common trend that we see here. And that is the broader middle power dynamic. So across the survey, we see that Southeast Asians are placing greater value on middle power. This is a bit of a new trend here. Not just India, but of course, like countries like Japan, Australia, and South Korea. And I think that actually reflects the desire of ASEAN to increase actually or expand its strategic options. And of course, within this context, India has actually benefited. So I would say that in short, India is not ASEAN's top three external partners, but trajectory is very positive. ASEAN elites are beginning to see India less as a peripheral player, but more as a genuine strategic weight in the region. And I just talked very little about the strategic. This is actually my second last slide. So I'll just talk very little bit about strategic convergence and where we can find alignment. And I think the AOIP and IPOI was really a great starting point, actually, to begin to talk about our common values, which are openness, inclusivity, respect for international law, neutrality amidst the great power rivalry. And I thought I want to quote something that your Prime Minister has said, but it's a bit long ago at the Shangri-La Dialogue. But I think this is something that Singapore would agree very much with as well. He said that when nations stands on the side of principles and not behind one power or another, they actually earn respect and a stronger voice in the international affairs. I mean, this is the sort of statement that Singapore would really, you know, appreciate. So that's one. And two, it's there is really an instinct for new balance, because when we talk about neutrality and your non-alignment, we can actually see a lot of similarities here. So we had the 1971 ZOFAN, right? Which is you mentioned in your book, Zone of Peace, Freedom, and Neutrality, and of course your non-alignment policy and the need to focus on functional cooperation. And the last point, which I thought was rather interesting, is that both ASEAN and India likes very broad pluralistic approaches. So we bring our partners into mechanisms like the East Asia Summit, ASEAN Regional Forum, ADMM+. And then for India, you also like to engage through multiple layers, like the Quad, the Bay of Bengal, you know, Initiative for Multi-Sectorial Technical and Economic Cooperation, BIMSTEC, and of course the IORA, which is the Indian Ocean Rim Association. So, you know, this is sort of the kind of flexibility that allows both sides to work together on a wide range of issues and to advance what we call a multipolar world, right? That's the new buzzword of these days. Last one, economic relations. I think that's where we really find the greatest challenges and opportunities. Well, we talk about the importance of ASEAN as India's trading partner, over 130 billion in trade and all that. However, I think both Prof. Iqbal and Ambassador Singh raised very good point, about how India feels that there is a trade imbalance, which remains very heavily in ASEAN's favor. So for policymakers in India, I think of course, they will raise concerns that India is opening its market without securing reciprocal benefits. I think that's the common narratives there. And of course, the anxiety is really sharpened, by the reality that ASEAN supply chains are already very deeply integrated with China and other East Asian economies, and that leaves India feeling quite disadvantaged. And that's where the Commerce Minister China B team comment, came about. And of course, this leads us to the second challenge, which is India's absence from the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Of course, by choosing not to join, I mean, India has sort of excluded itself from this sort of integrated network, and that actually makes it harder for Indian exporters to participate in the regional supply chains, since you might face higher cost and stricter compliance compared to RCEP members. So in practice, I mean, like that has meant that ASEAN's trade with the +3, China, Korea, and Japan, has expanded under RCEP, while India seems to be left at a certain margin. But don't worry about that. I want to talk about ASEAN-India trade in goods agreement soon. So, of course, the third challenge is really the limited presence of Indian businesses and investment in Southeast Asia. I know Indian firms are very strong globally. And then in areas like IT, in pharmaceutical, in startups, you can be in US, you can be in Europe, you can be in Africa, but your footprint in ASEAN is really very limited as compared to Japan, China, Korea's footprint in Southeast Asia. So for ASEAN, this means that the relationship looks very government heavy. You talk about security, right? You want to push it away from trade because of fewer private sector, drivers to actually sustain growth. And the very last part is, how can we actually do better? And I think Prof. Iqbal started out with the geopolitical uncertainty, 50% tariffs imposed by the US on India, one of the highest that you get amongst all countries in the world. I think that will really push India to diversify markets. But to be honest, ASEAN is not going to replace the scale of the US market overnight. It's impossible. But of course, ASEAN can definitely become a stronger partner in absorbing and help to diversify, India's trade and investment flows. So because ASEAN has a huge consumer base, it can be 700 million soon. And it's actually very deeply, integrated into the East Asian supply chains. But of course, there are other areas that we need to work on, right? So I want to talk about maybe just 3 recommendations from the 8th ASEAN-India network of think tanks. You know that very well. It was a 2 days event, and my 3 things that I mentioned, is doing a lot of injustice, to like that 20, 30 recommendations that came out of it. But I think most of the speakers, actually highlighted the importance of reviewing the ASEAN-India trade in goods agreement. So you can't be in RCEP. So what can you do? So the next best thing you can do is upgrade, your agreement with ASEAN. And then you can, explore reducing tariffs on intermediate goods. And then maybe harmonization of standards and simplify the rules of origin. Some of it you have mentioned. Connectivity is very important. We are a little bit disappointed about the India, Myanmar, Thailand trilateral highway, but it's no one to blame. There is a political situation in Myanmar, and all of us understand. But there is now the momentum of digital connectivity. And I know India, Singapore has real-time payment systems. We should roll it across ASEAN. That can help MSMEs, and India has a lot of MSMEs as well. And I think that could be rather transformative. And of course, green economy, there's a lot of news coming up on that. I just heard the news yesterday about your semiconductor.
Yes.
It's like, well, I wanted to congratulate you for that. Yes, but these will be the basic parts towards things like clean energy, opportunities in solar, wind, EVs, green hydrogen. You are growing them. ASEAN needs them. I think that is a good linkages there. And of course, lastly, I'll just close with implementation. There is very extensive ASEAN-India plan of action, 5 years, which nobody can read through it because it's just too long. When you reach page number 5, you would fall asleep. So, but in any case, we need to implement it. And of course, we need the right tools to track progress. We need political will and of course some sort of coordination. But please think about the private sector involvement, because I think that is really very important. And I'm just going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank
Oh, by the way, for a copy of the survey, there is a link somewhere in the PowerPoint. You can flash it out later in case you're interested.
Thank you, Joanne, for that rich talk, and for not just highlighting the trajectory of how India is perceived in this region, but also for your observations on how to take this relationship forward. With that, I turn to my friend Ravi. Ravi, you've studied this relationship, you've viewed it, you've been part of this relationship from both sides, right? Could I invite you to share your opinion? But before I do that, right, both previous speakers have invoked Bollywood. It'll be remiss of me not to invoke it as well. The song Kuch Kuch Hota Hai was brought up. I wonder if, given the geopolitical environment now, Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gum may be better analogy for that. So.
You have to spend 3.5 hours.
Sometimes these days you have to watch The Godfather to see what Donald Trump is doing. I mean, seems like there's a mafia in the White House at work. Thank you, Iqbal, and thank you, ISAS and ISEAS, for asking me to be here. And thank you, Joanne, for a very empathetic presentation. You know, you really startled me with that. I mean, it was significantly empathetic. I'm conscious of my limitations. I'm a storyteller. You know, I'm not a scholar or a practitioner of diplomacy like my colleagues on the panel. So when I was planning my remarks for this panel, I mean, the mind really went back to the arc of the relationship between India and ASEAN. And, you know, what I've seen over maybe 4 decades and more of my career, but particularly over the last 35 years since I've been associated with Singapore. Now, when I do that, you know, I tend to bookmark it with 2 speeches that took place in Singapore. One was hosted by ISEAS called the Singapore Lecture, the 3rd Singapore Lecture. And you know who delivered it? That was Prime Minister Narasimha Rao. And the Shangri-La Dialogue keynote delivered by Prime Minister Modi in 2018. And if you look at the arc of these, you know, what's happened between in this period, in 94 October, when Mr. Rao spoke in Singapore, you know, the promise of India was still unknown. You know, it was untapped, unmapped, pretty much unknown to the world. And he was at great pains to stress the promise of India, as he did very well. But he was also at great pains to suggest that the blue water navy that India was starting to build posed no threat to anybody in the world. In fact, if you read that speech, he quotes approvingly from an Australian Senate report of 1991 that says India does not have the capability of sustained force projection far beyond its boundaries. And his point was that, look, capability is intent. We don't have the capability, so there's no question of intent, any hostile intent. But if you turn to where India is today, India is fairly flexible, I mean, fairly comfortable flexing its muscles. Whether it's, you know, in terms of a positive thing like assuring rice supplies to Singapore or to the UAE during COVID, during, you know, during the lockdowns, or telling Turkish companies to leave India after Operation Sindhu, you know, there's a recent problem with Pakistan. So diffidence has moved to confidence. And on the strategic front, since the 2004 tsunami in which India declined help from anybody else, and in fact came to help of Southeast Asia in a big way, India has worn capability as a badge of honor. It does not underplay its muscles, but instead it emphasizes its restraint and its adherence to global rules of the road. That's I think something that I find fascinating. And it's even taken to being a weapons supplier in Southeast Asia, which is why I suspect that the perceptions have improved a little bit. And I tell you, next year it is going to improve even more, but not for the reasons that you might think, but for the fact that it has stood up to the United States. I think that is going to change perceptions of India in this region far more than any weapon sales to this territory.
I'm going to look forward to next year.
Yes. And if you really look at this relationship, it's not really India versus a multilateral, not really an ASEAN relationship, but it's a progression of several key bilateral relationships that have risen to a multilateral level. I think, if I'm not wrong, the first ambassador to ASEAN was accredited only in 2010, and the first so-called embassy to ASEAN established in 2015. Probably you were there.
After you.
Okay, so no, I was the last ambassador of Indonesia concurrently. I was the last ambassador of India to Indonesia concurrently accredited to ASEAN.
Right.
After me, there's a separate embassy.
That's what I'm
to
saying.
ASEAN,
So
yes.
from 2015,
Yes.
that was the thing.
Right.
And, and you can't blame India or anybody else for it. ASEAN barely knows itself, The fact is that, we do not have a flag. We do not sing the anthem. We don't even put the ASEAN emblem on the planes of our, of our civilian aircraft. We don't, ASEAN countries, more people in ASEAN are aware of the Appalachian Mountains in America than the Visayas in Philippines. That is the fact of ASEAN. We haven't really cohered. And it's not really easy to cohere also, given the big disparities and all that, but we're working on it. And this is where Singapore has really had an outsized role to play in this Indian journey into ASEAN and further east. Now, why did India do it at the time that it did it? In my mind, there are really three reasons. First, India was not very sure. A newly liberalized India was not really sure how to tackle globalization. And I think Singapore helped guide India through that process in a very useful way, and it's appreciated. Second, obviously, was as a source for funds. I remember after Mr. Goh Chok Tong spoke about sparking a mild India fever, there were editorials written in India saying, "Hey, give us all your reserves. We'll take very good care of it for you, and you can turn a very good return." And in fact, it's proved to be correct, because if you look at Temasek data for the last 10 years, the best performing market for Temasek consistently, regardless of the fall in currency, has been the Indian market. So India has delivered for on the investments that have been put in. And the third is not very well recognized. Both Mr. Rao, who was Prime Minister, and Dr. Singh, who was his Finance Minister, and later Prime Minister, of course, they saw Singapore's strategic proximity to the United States as something that they thought would be useful for India as India itself started improving relations with the United States. This is why my friend Dr. Baru says that Dr. Singh is overappreciated as an economist and underappreciated as a strategist. Actually, Dr. Manmohan Singh had one of the finest strategic minds of prime ministers. And I think he picked a lot of it from Mr. Narasimha Rao. So I don't want to go too much into the into that journey. But again, and I want to point to one example, which is, makes a lot of news here, which is CICA. CICA was signed because WTO process had slowed down, and Mr. George Yeo, who was our trade minister, went to Goh Chok Tong and said, look, let's try to do some big bilateral stuff, and came to India. And, and discussions began with Mr. Vajpayee, and it was concluded under Dr. Manmohan Singh. Dr. Manmohan Singh was under a lot of pressure from, including very recalcitrant bureaucrats within the system to not concede, what he did. But I do know for certain that one of the reasons why he was willing to be quite accommodative of Singapore's various requests, because he saw that as a stealth way of opening up the economy. He said, you give it to Singapore today, and tomorrow people will start demanding the same parity, and we'll have to start giving it, and then we can liberalize India that way. And sure enough, Malaysia got its own CICA, they call it the MI CICA, 5 years after the Singapore and India signed it. And this is a strategy that you see coming up again and again in Indian prime ministers, especially ones who run coalitions. Mr. Vajpayee, when he was prime minister in 2002, he announced something that's very important for ASEAN, Open Skies Agreement at the Bali summit. And there were a lot of people who within the Indian system were not very comfortable with open skies. But Vajpayee's point was, I have announced it, now go and do it. So many a time you see this kind of gambits being deployed by Indian prime ministers. And of course, if you look at the strategic front, the first maritime exercises that Singapore did with India was called SIMBEC, started in 1994. There were a lot of people within the Indian system who were not sure. But today it is India's longest running military exercise. And again, to stress my point about the bilateral getting into the multilateral, in 2023, ASEAN and India navies all came together, right? And last month, India and the Philippines did something quite interesting, which I'm sure China was not too pleased. They conducted exercises in the South China Sea. So, so all along, I think Singapore has been a big contributor in this journey. In 2005, it was Singapore that pushed India into the East Asian Summit. And I know the host, Malaysia, I think it was Mr. Badawi was Prime Minister then. They were most reluctant to bring us in, but they did, and that was Singapore's doing. So now, that aside, I think the disappointments from ASEAN are valid and real. Latterly, if I may say so, despite what Ambassador Gurjeet has said, I cannot but feel that there's been a sort of benign neglect of ASEAN from India. And this, I know, officials do come up for all those meetings. The Prime Minister shows up for the East Asia Summit. All that's great. But the fact is that India has had bigger preoccupations than ASEAN. And some of it is because after the United States stopped looking at India through an Atlantic lens and instead started looking at India through a Pacific lens, India's importance in the scheme of things rose significantly, and India reacted positively. And more than once, you see, like the Quad, for instance, it basically leapfrogs ASEAN. I don't think India consulted ASEAN on Quad, right? And, Shinzo Abe in Japan, coming up with this concept, confluence of the two oceans, the US renaming of PACOM to Indo-PACOM, the very concept of Indo-Pacific, which is really meant to push down China's salience to the region and elevate India's, it's a play to Indian vanities. I don't think India fell for it completely, but you can't help being flattered when, the world's superpower starts calling that and others start following suit. And in 2018, India hosted all the heads of ASEAN at a commemorative summit. But the very next year, it got out of RCEP, right? So I think from what I see, India, when it looks at ASEAN today, there was a time when it may have seen ASEAN as greater than the sum of its parts. But today, I suspect when India looks towards ASEAN, it sees ASEAN as less than the sum of its parts. And it sees an ASEAN that is divided, that has been politically divided very successfully. And at the same time, India is getting a lot of traction from the West. So while the Prime Minister may have spoken about an Act East policy in 2014, the fact is that it has had more successes looking west. If you look at Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and the way they have responded to India, India's got a lot of traction from these countries. And so I2U2 and new formulations, like that have come up. You can't blame India for that, but the fact of the matter is you go where you're liked, and I can't blame them for it. But at the same time, I do think that it was a little unfair of Mr. Piyush Goyal to call, ASEAN as China's B team. Even if you think so, you don't say these things, And again, on CLMV countries, I don't see a lot of Indian activity there anymore. Some of it is because they've been actively blocked, if you talk to people there. But the fact is that there's also, Myanmar has become such a problem, as it. But to address today's topic, which is about deepening the engagement, as Ambassador Gurjeet said, it's really time come now for the two to cast fresh eyes upon each other and build a better, stronger relationship. For the same reason that Ambassador said, which is that the political situation, the churn, it is throwing up new opportunities and new challenges. The prospect of better India-China relationship is really tantalizing in terms of a whole lot of things, including reduced defense budgets, which could possibly be, fed to development purposes. And if that relationship goes well, then India's Look East policy will take a new meaning altogether, and ASEAN could benefit from it. Generally, ASEAN likes to see these two big countries, tectonic plates, get along better, although there are small temporary advantages in intermediating some of those flows and all that. But for the larger good, I think it is best that these two tectonic plates of Asia get along. But at the same time, this means that there has to be adjustments from India towards ASEAN, because so far, India has pitched itself as an alternative to China, in a sense, in terms of as a political thing. You can contradict me on that, but the fact is that as a political edifice, and even in a gentle security kind of way, which is why, India did help out with creating, updating the military doctrines of Vietnam, the BrahMos sale, the recent trip that Ambassador spoke about. Prabowo is in India, and he has real interest in diversifying his thing and getting cheaper and indigenizing. And one of the spin-offs that came out of this recent clash with Pakistan was that it seems that indigenous Indian equipment did perform well. That gives India opportunities to offer it to the neighborhood. But there are really two or three issues in which the two really need to talk very closely. And one is, of course, the second China shock, the dumping that's going on in Southeast Asia and decimating industries, the auto industry in Thailand is in deep trouble. Indonesia, the job losses that are coming up. You're seeing the unrest already, I warned about it in a column in April that today China is pushing batik shirts into Indonesia, and this kind of dumping, and one of the things coming out of this recent settlement with China is that I suspect it's a good thing that India will have to expose its markets to more Chinese goods in order to keep the peace on the borderlands. These are going to opportunities for ASEAN and India to sit together. There are developments happening. India is developing the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which places India in Southeast Asia. Once you develop that, India is not really, you can't see India anymore as a South Asian nation, but you have to start seeing it. And for me, it was a matter of disappointment that the first flights, international flights into Port Blair were not from Singapore, but from Malaysia. AirAsia was the first to start flying there in January. There are other things which I think I should keep for the Q&A, and let's just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi, for eloquently. Actually, in a sense, you've kind of brought focus to some of the issues that we started discussing. And I have questions for everyone, but I'm not going to do that because I want to actually open the floor to everyone. I'm sure you have questions that are brewing. But I'll just, since I have the mic, I'm just going to ask one question to Ambassador Gurjit. I sort of respond to some of the points that were brought up by Joanne and Ravi as well. In your book, you actually have conducted a survey, which is sort of like a complement to the survey that Joanne spoke about. And your survey was essentially about the views that Indians have on ASEAN. Would you care to speak about that and highlight some of the key findings that you have?
Thank you. Thank you, Joanne and Ravi, for your excellent remarks. All I can say is if you read my book, you'll get answers to most of them, including why India did not join the RCEP and why India does not see itself as a balancer to China in the region. It's not a mantle we sought for ourselves. All this is there. But to answer your specific question, when I started doing this book, and I think the idea was born in a conversation with you, is sitting upstairs. And then when I met Sharon, then I realized that there is enough to talk about. And having been ambassador to ASEAN, it gives you a ringside view, which many people outside don't have. So I said, let me understand how Indians view ASEAN, not government. And that is the big thing about your survey. It is about ASEAN people largely viewing their partner. And then I spoke to a lot of people, and I think in my book, I've given the division. How many are retired civil servants? How many are retired military people? How many are academic students, civil society people? I tried to balance this out as much as I could, but it is not a perfect sample, but I think it's a good sample. It gives you a view. And one of the things is that despite all efforts as an ambassador, I still think that Indians believe ASEAN is a stable partner, but largely an economic entity. They don't see the full impact of the Act East policy. That is one. The second part is they all think the Act East policy needs to be revamped to give more emphasis to political security and socio-cultural method. And in socio-cultural, a lot of suggestions came up, some of which I mentioned, which is beyond the traditional ideas. So I personally think that is the good part of the book, that it gives you a grassroots opinion of ASEAN. And just as we can't argue with what your survey says, I think you will get a view of the Indians who are not in government, how they view ASEAN. For instance, they all believe that a lot of Indians go to ASEAN countries, but not enough come in the same planes. The Indians go in the plane and Indians come back in the planes. I mean, that is the story of open skies. The other thing also, I think many people realize that the FTA with ASEAN was actually an Indian idea, not so well known. In Vajpayee, when he came to start the process, they said, let's offer this. And another thing I mentioned in my book is that ASEAN invited India to its first summit on Diwali. Now, can you imagine in India what that means? But Vajpayee decided that we had invested enough to spend Diwali in Cambodia rather than say, I am not going because it is Diwali, which he did now. In 2023, when we had the 30th anniversary comprehensive security, Modi did not go because there were commitments in India. But in 2001, Vajpayee went because the investment was very high. So I think I've tried to bring in these experiences which are off the ground into the book. And I hope that when you read the book, you will enjoy them. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Okay, with that, I'm going to open for questions. Could I, because we have a hard stop at a certain time because the speakers have prior engagements, could I request that you keep your questions short so we can have more questions? And just introduce yourself very briefly. So, sir.
Yeah. My name is Arup Raha, address the ambassador. All three of you kept referring to ASEAN, ASEAN, ASEAN as if it's one homogeneous area. It's not, you know that. I mean, you have Indonesia at the top down to Brunei that is small. How much of the conversations that you have are bilaterally between countries, between India and each of the individual countries, and how much of your conversations are actually with the bloc?
Yeah. Are there any other questions? I can take 2 or 3 at the same time. Okay, I'll take Amitendu first. I'll take 3 questions.
Hi, Ambassador. Good to see you again. Shivani, I had a question on the survey and partly connected to what Ravi mentioned as well, the India standing up to the United States and the possibility of perceptions improving. What do you think will happen post-SCO? Are perceptions going to improve even further? There's a reason why I'm asking that, because there's often this view that has held across diverse constituencies that India's engagement of Southeast Asia can't really proceed effectively if it is totally unaligned to engagement with China. So I'm just wondering if there's a connection between the two.
And there was a question in the back.
Hi, thank you. I'm Michael from MUFG Bank. Ambassador Singh, I think it's quite fascinating that you said from India's perspective, there's an immense amount of frustration with ASEAN on trade. I think to be fair, there's perhaps also a perception that from ASEAN's perspective, regards to India, there's also a lot of barriers to trade, etc. So I'd like to hear from your perspective, what specifically about ASEAN from India's perspective? Is it that, India thinks ASEAN should change and can change? And I mean, we know there are a lot of non-tariff barriers, etc. So I wonder from India's perspective, what these are.
Ambassador, do you want to start? I'll
Yeah.
come back to the next round
Okay.
of questions.
Thank you. So let me answer Mr. Raha first. So ASEAN is the entity with which we engage. So there is an annual India-ASEAN summit. We have worked very hard to get there. So we're not going to give it up. But after 30 years of India-ASEAN engagement, today I think India is looking for ASEAN plus policies from its members, so that we engage beyond ASEAN. What ASEAN agrees is fine. Beyond that, what can we do? And countries which are willing to take on ASEAN plus policies, India engages with them more. In 2025 itself, with your Prime Minister in India now, 4 ASEAN leaders have been to India this year. Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, and now Singapore. So there is, sorry, Vietnam is coming. So country. Whereas the ASEAN Secretary General was only invited last year after a very long time. So there is institutionally, unlike the African Union, where the union play the role, here ASEAN Secretariat, with due apologies, does not play that big a role in the relationship. So largely you have to work with the chair. And I think that has been a lacuna in our policy. The Chinese work so well with the chair. Look how they worked with Malaysia, and they got this ASEAN, GCC, China summit. But I think okay, my idea that Indonesia took the lead for the ASEAN Indo-Pacific infrastructure something, right? Forum, right? Didn't take off. I presume this GCC thing will also fall with Malaysia's presidency. But Philippines is coming. So I was joking with the Philippines people when they were in India that you should do a Quad initiative. After all, they have been so keen on the Squad. Why not a Quad initiative? Given the state of the Quad today, I think having the Indo-Pacific partners of the Quad, which is India, Australia, and Japan, meeting with ASEAN on the sidelines of the next summit would be a step forward, and I would consider it a ASEAN plus move. Why ASEAN should engage Quad is in my book, and how overtures have been made, not made. I think you asked that question. But once when Quad started, I did talk to ASEAN, and they all asked me, so when will China join Quad? And then we will look at it. Now, that is not being realistic. So we want to deal with the member states of ASEAN who will deal with us realistically. Simply, also when you say how the naval power is perceived, I think the fact that any time there is a requirement for HADR, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, have you ever wondered how the Indian ship is always first, whether in the South China Sea or in Madagascar, Mozambique? It is because we are there all the time. But we are benign, we don't talk about it, we are not that visible, we are there. But when something happens, now these ships are carrying portable water machines to desalinate. They are carrying food, they're carrying medicine, because their primary aim is to provide succor and not to make a sucker out of you. Thank you.
Do you want to address the other question as well?
On that one, you're from the Japanese bank, right?
Yep.
Yeah. But, on trade, again, I have gone in great detail in my book, and I've given both sides, because I had a lot of interviews on the ASEAN side, what they feel. So India feels that ASEAN does not open its doors enough. Two of our most strategic partners in ASEAN, Indonesia and Vietnam, are the worst in providing access to India. Worst. So it doesn't make sense. And they are among our bigger trading partners. With Singapore, we don't have. Singapore is a zero trader to everybody, But Indonesia is not. And when you look at overall India-ASEAN trade, it is not understood that deficits rise as much as India imports more coal and palm oil from ASEAN, which is essentially Indonesia to extend Malaysia. When that drops, the deficit drops. Indian exports are not doing well in ASEAN, but the discrepancy between India's overall export performance and that with ASEAN, while not being congruent, is not very different. But that is what India wants, that you are my partner, so you should do more. The solution lies in more resilient supply chains between India and ASEAN. Indian businessmen don't understand FTAs. The best users of the ITGA are Japanese and Korean companies in India, not Indian companies. That is an unfortunate fact. So we keep negotiating FTAs, which our own people don't know how to take advantage of. So recently, when I was in Japan, Prime Minister Ishiba spoke about Japan, India, Indian Ocean, Africa community. He skips ASEAN. Why does Japan not want to work with India on supply chains in ASEAN is a question which I next need to deal with. Thank you.
Joanne and Ravi, you were both invoked to Amitendu's question. So Joanne, do you want to go?
Yes, I'm going to answer the question about the post-perception. I mean, the perception post SCO, right? That question. But I think before that, I'll just take a minute to respond to what you said. Actually, I found your responses to be very interesting, just as I found your book to be very interesting. I mean, you were talking about the difference between ASEAN member states and ASEAN. It's because I think that you can understand ASEAN's dynamics and nuances, but for some reason, people don't pen it down. But you happen to pen it down, and actually what you said about the important role of ASEAN's chair. You know, you look at ASEAN, yes, 10 countries, but ASEAN Study Center, we look at ASEAN as an organization, but we know that a lot of initiatives within ASEAN has to be led by people, right? It cannot just simply come out from the SecGen, you know, or some department within it. So we call it a leaders-led organization. It's different from the EU. So that's why you have things like the ASEAN China GCC summit, which we have never seen before, and suddenly coming out during the Malaysian chairmanship because it happens to be a priority of Prime Minister's Anwar, probably alone, not his bureaucracy. Even so, yeah. I mean, if there was a very strong personality coming out from Philippines next year and decides to do this ASEAN Quad with whoever else, maybe AUKUS, yeah, not AUKUS, then, really, who knows, So actually, now I'm going to go to talk about the percent. Okay, so when we did this survey, it was really, I mean, I didn't have time to go into the details of methodologies and that sort of things. It was in the beginning of Jan to the middle of Feb. So I would say that it was way before tariffs announcements. And it even straddles the inauguration of President Trump on January 20. So there were some who took before, some who took after, but there were no discernible differences between the two groups. But and of course, US was seen favorably. If you look at this survey, you will see that they are doing very well still. But I wouldn't say the same if the survey was conducted today or if the survey was conducted next year. And yes, you're right. Maybe if the survey was conducted next year, India might perform even better based on many things, how they managed to stand up to the US. And yes, but this SCO, I think that the framing of this Prime Minister Modi participation in the SCO is really, especially the media's framing, is actually post-Trump's tariffs, that 50%. And, you get a lot of narratives like, okay, now it's time for India to start diversifying, looking to others, maybe working more closely with China and that sort of thing. So that's, that sort of framing. And maybe this would also be India's chance to really step up engagement with Southeast Asia as well. But was the question about can it proceed without China, or can it proceed with China?
Can it engage people with ASEAN with focus to counter China first?
Well, from an ASEAN perspective, of course, we like all our dialogue partners to be able to work well with each other. I mean, India is in the same forum with China in the East Asia Summit, in the ARF, in the ADMM Plus, and would we want to have, too many conflicting views within an ASEAN-led mechanism? Of course not. But I mean, I'll also be very, very honest here that, there was a question earlier about hedging, right? Why India is seen as a very good partner in hedging against US-China rivalry is because of India's multi-alignment. So that means that India is seen in Western-led platform, is also seen in US-led platform. You can be in Quad, you can be in SCO, you can be in BRICS and every others. But that's also why, sometimes people label India as the weakest link in Quad. It's because the other members are more willing to balance China a little more, or even to the extent of countering China, whereas India may not be so willing. But I don't mean that India has not much issue or trust issue with China. It will always be there. But because you are also pragmatic in a certain way and you see value in China as well. So yes, if you can work closely with China, well, it would be better for ASEAN as well. Maybe you might also rethink your stance about RCEP as well. In fact, I have this article called Can India Have Its Cake and Eat It Too? So maybe, you can maybe take a look at this article and see, this fantastic skill of, India in trying to balance everyone. But how long, that sort of things is going to last? Ultimately, is there a choice we made? Really, we don't know. A lot of things are still being developed right now.
Ravi, would you like to respond?
No, I think let's go to the next one.
I saw a few more hands, so Ivan. You want? No, okay. So, okay, yeah, we'll start there. We'll come to Ivan.
Thank you so much.
Let her go, she's got a mic, so yeah. So you go ahead first.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you. So maybe it's a comment or a question, two of them. One you just mentioned, and I'm taking off from there, that whether India had the cake and ate it too. I think it's China has had the cake and eaten it too, because it's benefited both ways. By standing up to the United States, it's been able to, with retaliatory tariffs, been able to lower it. And also, as far as the India-China relationship is concerned, China is the one which benefits greatly, immensely. And a lot has been written about this. In fact, it's so sad that our, the Prime Minister Wang's visit has actually been downplayed, or it's got submerged within the entire cacophony and the noise around the SCO and the optics that played out between Putin and Prime Minister Modi, and the three leaders standing next to each other. So really, I feel it's like China is benefiting greatly. And of course, again, India-China relationship will continue to have the undercurrents. And I think it's extremely difficult for the trust deficit to be removed because of the Islami slicing, which continues, and the gradual territory, that's being taken over in India. Secondly, the question about tariffs. We saw that the 9th round of ASEAN-India trade in goods agreement of negotiations, which continued from 2015. The 9th round was held in February, and after that, the newspapers were completely flush with stories that the Indian businesses do not want this agreement to go ahead. It's a very bad deal, and we should just scrap it. And then all of a sudden in August, after President Trump announced the tariffs, the 10th round was held just barely 3 days before the India-Singapore third ministerial roundtable. So this happened actually almost simultaneously, and Singapore again has played an important role. So, we are still kind of wondering how many more rounds of negotiations. And again, India now saying that ASEAN is moving very slowly, but ASEAN also says that about India. So if you have any views on that, sorry, I took a little bit.
Well, Ivan Lidaref, I'm a visiting fellow here at ISAS. Thank you for a wonderful panel. Now check the book. My question is, there is a crisis between ASEAN and India, and this crisis is Myanmar. Obviously, that's the place where the two sides meet. So is there any engagement over the situation in Myanmar between ASEAN and India, and what are the prospects for some cooperation in this? Because I'm sure that both sides are very concerned. I definitely am certain about the Indian side, and I believe that's the case also with ASEAN. Thank you.
Yeah, anybody with a last question? Okay. We have 5 minutes more before we have to go. So, you want to take it?
Thank you. So let me answer the one on Myanmar. So I think we need to be clear. Myanmar is India's neighbor well before ASEAN was ever thought of. So that ASEAN should never forget. Myanmar, neighbor first, ASEAN later. So our interests are different from other ASEAN countries in Myanmar. Need not go into the details. But when ASEAN had an engagement, once led by Indonesia, once led by Thailand, India was a part of both. And we played our role. More recently at SCO, when Senior General Lang was there, Prime Minister Modi has met him. Now, this is not to cock a snook at ASEAN. It is simply because our neighbor, we cannot have Bangladesh, Myanmar, everybody on our borders disturbed at one time. It has problems for us. So I think you need to look at it in that framework. So when the 5-point consensus was there, India was for it. When ASEAN could not take it forward, India was concerned. Then when Thailand took some initiatives, India joined them. When Indonesia took some, India joined them. India wants to be part of a solution. We want a stable government in Myanmar which will not allow threats to Indian security to emanate and open its field on an even basis to Indian companies, which was what was happening earlier and has now stopped. You already mentioned that the trilateral highway is disrupted because of situation in Myanmar. That is disturbing to us. We would like a government in Myanmar which will, take passionately own that project, and then only it will go forward. So that is my view on Myanmar. Thank you. On China, actually, the entire thesis of my book is that we should stop thinking about China and deal India and ASEAN by ourselves. And you'll probably get better things done. If you're always looking what will China say and all that, that is, I think, impediment to the India-ASEAN relationship. It is a reality. Both recognize it. But I don't think India looks to ASEAN to condemn Chinese action in the Himalayas. Though ASEAN countries do look to us to continuously have a refrain that we stand by UNCLOS. So India stands by ASEAN centrality, India stands by ASEAN unity, India stands by UNCLOS, and is implementing South China Sea. We want to add one word. We want to see ASEAN responsibility on all these things. And that will make life easier for us. And till that happens, we will keep saying these things, but action is with ASEAN, not with us. Thank you.
I add one sentence about ASEAN. One sentence. Actually, you said it very, very well. So as ASEAN, we always tell our partners, do not look at ASEAN or do not work with ASEAN in the lens of major power rivalry. So basically, when you are dealing with us, deal with us on our own merits. What kind of cooperation we can work together? What are the mutual benefits we can get each other, but not say, well, can ASEAN helps to balance this power? Can we use ASEAN to, prevent this power from doing that? Well, that is the worst situation that we ever want to be put in, And actually, to be honest about China as well, yes, China in the survey is the most influential economic, political, security partner, and the top strategically relevant partner is topped in every category. But we still have to remember one thing. The region is also wary about China's rise. And you can see it clearly in the survey as well. Like, do you welcome or do you fear China's rise? You will see that the fear of China's rise is actually very high. So that means that there are things that we are watching out as well. Yeah.
Ravi, the final word on India-ASEAN?
I just want to talk about the earlier mention of the GCC countries. The GCC countries, the last 3 years, I've been pushing within ASEAN circles and in my columns that ASEAN should take a broader view of Asia and not just let it stop with the Indian subcontinent. That the countries to the West, West Asian countries, they are very much a part of Asia. I mean, they're part of our cultural flows, trade flows and all that, but we consciously shut them out. For some good reasons, we don't want the politics of that to spill over here. I understand that. But the fact is that growth in Asia is shifting southward and westward. The eastern corner, northeastern corner of Asia is slowing, aging. And if you look at the Philippines, if you just look at the league tables for GDP numbers at the Asian crisis and today, you see how much it's changed. A lot of people here may not be aware that Singapore GDP is actually higher than Thailand's today, which makes Singapore the second biggest economy in ASEAN in GDP terms. It's not known. So growth is shifting, towards India, towards the Middle East. You see what's happening, Saudis are growing very well. And it is time for ASEAN and India. Nobody has networks in the Middle East or West Asia as India does. And there's a huge opportunity, which we talked about, for joint projects to go into this region and to work together to understand that. And after West Asia, to go into Africa. because the promise of Africa, if growth has to, real big growth has to come, for all of us, we need to tap the African growth at some point. And I think the Indian networks there are enormous, and we need to do that.
Okay.
Since he mentioned this, I want to say, when Prime Minister Modi came to Jakarta for the ASEAN summit, 2 days before the G20 summit, at the G20, the IMECC was going to be announced. But he offered the extension of that to ASEAN in his speech at Jakarta. No response. In 2015, Modi offered the International Solar Alliance without the name to ASEAN because he was going to announce it in France. No response. So there is something missing, that ASEAN does not want to join India's international or global or regional initiatives. There's something in that. It's also mentioned in my book. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to thank all three speakers for an engaging and illuminating discussion and for engaging with the questions as well. I have to call this to a close in 30 seconds. And I'd just like to say that I noted the words that all three of you have used. Interestingly, growth, opportunities, and promises came up the most from all three. So I think that's a good note to call a close to this discussion on India-ASEAN relations. Ambassador Gurjeet Singh, I congratulate you on the book. I think a lot of us are looking forward to reading it. And we welcome you back with your next book to ISAS as well.
Thank you.
Joanne, thank you for this collaboration. It's always great to work with ISIS, and thank you for joining us. And Ravi, as usual, ISAS is one of your homes as well. So thank you for joining us. And thank you all for being with us today.
Thank you.